Every sport has its dynasties, but baseballs are different. They aren't just stretches of dominance, they're eras that define generations. That set standards of greatness so high they warp everything that comes after them, eras where a single team doesn't just win, it rewrites the rules of expectation. And in baseball, those dynasties have shaped the very identity of the game itself. And if you want to understand why fans cling to history as fiercely as they do box scores, you need to walk through these dynasties one by one, because each was more than championships. They were cultural earthquakes, each changing how baseball was played, watched, and remembered. And that is why the story begins not in the Bronx, where most people expect, but in Boston, in the early 1910s, when the Red Sox became baseball's first true dynasty. A powerhouse that would dominate the sport and then vanish into an 86-year drought that haunted the franchise like a curse, because from 1912 to 1918, the Red Sox weren't just good, they were unbeatable, winning for World Series in 7 years, piling up pennants, and establishing a winning percentage over .600, which in baseball means you weren't simply a contender, you were a juggernaut. And their success was built on stars who, in hindsight, seem almost mythological. Players like Tris Speaker, the center fielder whose glove was poetry and whose bat was just as lethal. A man who would finish his Boston career with Hall of Fame credentials and an MVP award. And Smokey Joe Wood, the kind of pitcher you only hear about in whispers today, because in 1912 he won 30 for games with a microscopic error, numbers so absurd they look like typos now. And Harry Hooper, the right fielder who outlasted them all, playing in every championship Boston won in that era, quietly becoming one of the most dependable hitters of his generation. But of course, no story of this dynasty can be told without mentioning the young Babe Ruth, who began his career as a pitcher for Boston before becoming the most famous slugger the sport has ever known, and for a brief, shining moment he was part of this machine, helping them cement their dominance before being sold to the Yankees in 1919, a move that didn't just end Boston's dynasty, but created one of the most infamous curses in sports history, the curse of the Bambino, which would loom over Boston until 2004. And here's what makes this dynasty fascinating. It wasn't just about winning, it was about laying the template. They showed that baseball teams could build around multiple stars, that pitching depth mattered, that championships weren't just about one great player, but about constructing rosters that could sustain excellence across seasons. And in doing so, they became both the sport's first dynasty and its first tragic collapse, because their brilliance was followed almost immediately by irrelevance. And so when we talk about Boston today, with their for modern championships, we have to remember that their story began here, in the dead ball era, with a dynasty that proved greatness was possible, and with a sale that proved it could be squandered in an instant. If Boston showed the world how a franchise could dominate, it was the Philadelphia Athletics under Connie Mack, who proved that dominance could look almost effortless when built with both brains and stars. Because from 1910 to 1914, the A's were more than a good ball club. They were baseball's first super team, a roster so loaded with Hall of Fame talent that they seemed less like a lineup and more like an all-star exhibition every time they took the field. And this was no accident. It was the product of Mack's genius, the tall, stoic manager who dressed like a banker in the dugout and ran his team like a businessman, building rosters with a long view, emphasizing fundamentals and loyalty in an era when other managers were scrambling just to stay afloat. And under his guidance, the A's won 3 World Series in 5 years for pennants overall, and averaged nearly 100 wins per season, a level of consistent dominance unheard of at the time. And their lineup reads today like the roll call of baseball's early aristocracy: Eddie Collins, the brilliant second baseman whose bat and glove made him the prototype for the position, piling up over 3,300 hits and a jaw-dropping WAR that would make even modern sabermetricians shake their heads: Home Run Baker, a third baseman who earned his nickname by leading the league in homers for straight seasons, in an era when home runs were scarce. His swing embodying power at a time when slapping singles was the norm: Chief Bender, the pitcher whose calm presence on the mound belied his killer instincts, posting dominant numbers in the postseason and etching his name as one of the earliest examples of a true October ace. And Eddie Plank, the soft-spoken lefty who quietly racked up nearly 300 wins with the kind of durability that seems alien today, a man who could take the ball again and still deliver. And together they made the A's a juggernaut, the kind of team you measured yourself against. And yet, here's where the story becomes more than just baseball, because the dynasty's undoing wasn't a lack of talent. It was money, plain and simple. Connie Mack, as brilliant as he was, operated in an era without television deals, without revenue sharing, without billionaire owners willing to absorb losses. And when financial strain hit after 1914, he dismantled his own masterpiece, selling off stars piece by piece, watching the greatest roster in the sport collapse not because it couldn't win anymore, but because it became too expensive to keep together. And that is what makes the A's dynasty so uniquely tragic. It didn't fade from lack of talent. It was torn apart at its peak, a reminder that dynasties are not just fragile on the field, but off it, subject to the economics of the time. And yet, in their brief reign, the A's established something that would echo through history, that building a championship team was about more than one superstar. It was about assembling a constellation of them. And for 5 seasons in the 1910s, Philadelphia's night sky shone brighter than anyone else's, even if financial storms would soon blow it all apart. Every dynasty builds on the ashes of what came before. And if Boston and Philadelphia showed the early blueprint, it was the New York Yankees who turned that blueprint into an empire. Because beginning in 1936, the Yankees didn't just dominate baseball, they began rewriting what dominance even meant, launching their first great dynasty in pinstripes, a run that saw them win 6 World Series in 8 years and establish the Bronx as the new capital of the baseball world. And what made this dynasty different from the A's or Red Sox before them was both scale and style. They didn't just win, they overwhelmed, averaging 100 wins a year in an era when rosters weren't yet padded with specialists, sweeping opponents aside with an ease that made the rest of the league look like they were playing catch-up. And at the center of it all were names that remained stitched into the very fabric of the sport. Lou Gehrig, the Iron Horse, whose bat and durability were so steady that he seemed eternal. His 1936 season alone a masterclass with a slash line that would make modern MVPs jealous. His leadership and grace in the face of his later Al's diagnosis making him not just a star, but a symbol of human resilience. Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper, a hitting machine whose swing was so fluid it seemed carved out of marble. A man whose 56-game hitting streak still stands as one of the most unbreakable records in sports. A figure who became not just an athlete, but a cultural icon, embodying both elegance and inevitability at the plate. Del Dickey, the rock behind the plate, steady and underappreciated, guiding pitchers and hitting with precision. A reminder that dynasties are built not just on glamour, but on glue players who hold everything together. And on the mound, the Yankees boasted Lefty Gomez and Red Ruffing, arms that piled up wins and delivered in October, proving that even in the offense-heavy lit ball era, pitching still anchored championships. And together this group created something beyond box scores. They created an aura, a sense that stepping into Yankee Stadium meant you were already down a run. And here's what makes their dynasty resonate. It bridged eras, born from Babe Ruth's departure, but laying the groundwork for the mantle and barriers that would follow, proving the Yankees weren't a one-on powerhouse, but a sustained machine. And even when tragedy struck, when Gehrig was forced to step away with Al's, the team carried on, DiMaggio stepping into the role of centerpiece, ensuring the dynasty didn't collapse under the weight of loss. And perhaps that resilience is what makes this dynasty so legendary. It wasn't just about 6 titles. It was about withstanding change, enduring personal tragedy, even seeing DiMaggio leave for military service in 1943 and still competing at the highest level. And so when you look back, this Yankees dynasty didn't just define the late 1930s. It defined the very idea of what it meant to be the Yankees: relentless, star-studded, and eternal. The dynasty that topped baseball, that dominance could be both inevitable and beautiful. If the Yankees of the late 1930s proved that dominance could be beautiful, then the Yankees of 1947 through 1960 proved that dominance could also feel eternal. Because this was not just a dynasty, this was the blueprint for sustained greatness in professional sports. 10 World Series championships in 18 years, 15 pennants, 5 consecutive titles from 1949 to 1953, and nearly 2 decades were the worst thing you could say about them was that they occasionally missed October, and even then only 3 times in that span, and the numbers only tell part of the story. Because what the Yankees built during these years wasn't just success, it was mythology. It was the idea that wearing pinstripes meant you were stepping into immortality, that every season began with the expectation of a pennant, and that anything less was failure, and the players who carried that mantle weren't just stars, they were icons. Beginning with Joe DiMaggio in the twilight of his career, transitioning to the electric rise of Mickey Mantle, a switch-hitting powerhouse whose bat and speed made him one of the most complete players the game has ever seen. A 3-time MVP, a 20-time All-Star, a man who hit balls so far and ran so fast that he seemed less human than myth. And alongside him was Yogi Berra, the squad catcher with the easy smile who was both the glue and the heart of the Yankees. A 3-time MVP, an 18-time All-Star, and the owner of more World Series rings as a player than anyone else in history, 10. And while Berra's quirks and famous Yogiisms made him beloved, his steady leadership and postseason heroics made him indispensable. And then there was Whitey Ford, the left-handed ace nicknamed the chairman of the board, a man who piled up wins and pitched with a calm precision that earned him Cy Young honors, and a World Series MVP, anchoring a pitching staff in an era when offense dominated headlines. And surrounding these 3 pillars were waves of talent: Phil Rizzuto, Roger Maris, Elston Howard, and so many others who flowed through the Yankees system like reinforcements in an army that never seemed to run out of soldiers. And yet, this dynasty was not just about players, it was about moments, the ones that stitched themselves into baseball's lore. None greater than Don Larsen's perfect game in the 1956 World Series, the only postseason perfect game in history, an achievement so improbable and so flawless that it came to symbolize Yankee invincibility, because only a team this dominant could produce such perfection on the game's biggest stage. And what made this dynasty enduring wasn't just the talent or the trophies, it was the aura, the sense that the Yankees were not playing the same sport as everyone else, that their standard of success was unreachable, and it created something powerful, both love and hate, because for every Yankee fan basking in the glory, there were millions of fans elsewhere who loathed them, who defined their own baseball experience as much by rooting against the Yankees as by rooting for their own teams. And that is what a dynasty does. It forces everyone else to measure themselves against you, to live in your shadow, and this Yankees dynasty cast the longest shadow of them all. And even as it came to a close in the early 1960s, with Mantle's body breaking down, with new challengers emerging, the legacy it left behind was more than championships. It was the identity of the Yankees themselves, the creation of America's team, the team of the pinstripes, the one word in baseball that instantly meant excellence, and perhaps even arrogance, but undeniably dominance. Not every dynasty stretches for decades. Not every dynasty produces double-digit titles, and yet some remain immortal precisely because of the intensity packed into their short reign. And that is exactly what the St. Louis Cardinals accomplished. Between 1942 and 1946, when in just 5 seasons they won 3 World Series championships for pennants, and in the process established themselves as the National League's answer to the Yankees, a team that showed the NL could produce dynasties of its own. And what makes this era of Cardinals baseball remarkable is the context, because these were the Warriors, rosters constantly shifting as players went off to military service, lineups patched together one season and rebuilt the next, and yet somehow the Cardinals not only endured, they thrived, fielding teams that won 105 games or more 3 years in a row from 1942 to 1944. An astonishing feat even today. And at the center of it all was a player who didn't just define the Cardinals. He defined baseball itself for an entire generation. Stan Musial, Stan the Man, the quiet superstar whose bat seemed endlessly reliable, winning batting titles, driving in runs, piling up hits until he finished with over 3,600 in his career. A man whose grace on and off the field made him not just a Cardinals legend, but one of the most respected athletes in all of American sport. And alongside Musial were players who embodied the scrappy, resilient character of those Cardinals teams. Enos Slaughter, a fiery outfielder and 10-time All-Star whose all-out play produced perhaps the most famous play in franchise history, the mad dash in Game 7 of the 1946 World Series, when he scored all the way from first base on a single, catching the Red Sox defense flat-footed and sealing the championship, a moment that came to symbolize the relentlessness of the Cardinals. Marty Marion, the slick fielding shortstop who earned an MVP award for his defense and leadership, proving that dynasties can be built not just on sluggers, but on glove-first players who controlled the infield, and Mort Cooper, the ace who dominated with a 20-7 season in 1942, winning MVP honors as a pitcher, an achievement almost unthinkable today. And together they gave the Cardinals an edge, a swagger that proved they could not only challenge the Yankees' dominance, but beat them as they did in the 1942 World Series, shocking the baseball world by taking down the Bronx juggernaut. And what makes this dynasty memorable isn't just the wins, it's the timing. Because while so many franchises stumbled through the uncertainties of World War II, the Cardinals thrived, adapting, adjusting, and somehow emerging stronger. And in doing so, they gave the National League its proudest dynasty moment of the era, one that still resonates in St. Louis today, where fans speak of Musial and Slaughter as more than athletes, but as symbols of a city's resilience. And while this dynasty lasted only 5 years, its impact lingers, proof that greatness doesn't always require decades. Sometimes it just takes the right players, the right moments, and the will to dash from first to home when nobody expects it. If the Cardinals of the 1940s were about grit and wartime resilience, then the Cincinnati Reds of the 1970s were about sheer, overwhelming firepower, a juggernaut so relentless they earned one of the most fitting nicknames in sports history, the Big Red Machine, because when they were firing on all cylinders, they didn't just win. They demolished, they overwhelmed. They made opponents feel like they were stuck in a storm they couldn't escape. And between 1970 and 1979, this machine won for National League pennants, to World Series championships, and averaged more than 95 wins a year, numbers that would be impressive in any era. But in the 1970s, when parity was higher and expansion had leveled talent across the league, it made them look almost unfair. And what set the Reds apart wasn't just one superstar, it was their lineup, famously dubbed the Great Eight, a collection of players so stacked with talent that opposing managers sometimes admitted they simply had no weak spot to attack. And leading the charge was Johnny Bench, the Hall of Fame catcher whose mix of defensive genius and offensive power redefined what the position could be. A two-time MVP who hit tape measure home runs while throwing out base runners with a cannon arm. And then Pete Rose, the controversial but undeniable hit king, a player whose hustle was legendary, who played with a ferocity that made every ground ball look like a life-or-death sprint, who finished his career as the all-time leader in hits with 4,256, and in the mid-70s was the emotional engine of this dynasty. And next to them was Joe Morgan, a second baseman so complete he might have been the best all-around player in baseball during the Reds' peak, winning back-to-back MVPs in 1975 and 1976, combining speed, power, defense, and an uncanny ability to get on base. And Tony Perez, the clutch RBI machine whose bat seemed to always deliver when the Reds needed him most. And George Foster, the muscle who smashed 50 home runs in 1977, becoming the first player in over a decade to hit 50+. A terrifying presence in the middle of the lineup, and even Ken Griffey Sr., often overshadowed by later generations of his family, was a vital cog, hitting over .30 multiple times and giving pitchers no room to breathe. And when you put all of this together, you got a lineup that looked more like an all-star team than a franchise roster. And the results showed. In 1975 and 1976, the Reds were untouchable, winning back-to-back World Series titles, sweeping the mighty Yankees in 1976 while going 7-0 in the postseason, outscoring their opponents 41-19. A level of dominance that sent a message not just to the league, but to history itself. This was one of the greatest lineups ever assembled, period. And what made them unforgettable wasn't just the wins, it was the style, the way Rose's head first, slides, Morgan's twitchy batting stance, and Bench's towering homers seemed to embody the energy of the 1970s, brash, electric, and unstoppable. And while the Big Red Machine's reign was relatively short, its impact endures, because when fans argue about the greatest teams of all time, the Reds of 75 and 76 are always in the conversation, and for good reason, because dynasties are measured not only in longevity, but in peak dominance, and in their peak, the Big Red Machine wasn't just dominant, it was devastating. If the Big Red Machine was a symphony of precision, the Oakland A's of the early 1970s were more like a rock band, loud, brash, sometimes dysfunctional, but capable of producing unforgettable brilliance when it mattered most, because between 1971 and 1975, the swinging A's did what even the Yankees had rarely managed, winning 3 consecutive World Series titles, 5 straight division crowns, and establishing themselves as the powerhouse of the American League, all while looking like they might combust at any moment, and that volatility is part of what makes this dynasty so unique, because unlike the Yankees of the 50s or the Reds of the 70s, these A's weren't polished, they were scrappy, defiant, and led by an owner in Charlie Finley who was equal parts visionary and chaos agent, a man who loved bright colors, gimmicks, and confrontation as much as he loved winning, and yet somehow, despite the infighting and the bizarre management style, the A's became one of the greatest teams of their era, and the talent they had was undeniable. Starting with Reggie Jackson, Mr. October, a slugger whose bat delivered some of the most iconic postseason blasts, whose charisma and swagger made him both a hero and a villain, and who in 1973 alone won both AL MVP and World Series MVP honors, hitting with a combination of power and flair that defined the A's championship run. And then Catfish Hunter, the ace who gave them credibility every 4th day, a workhorse who won 21 or more games in every year of their dynasty stretch, and capped it off with a Cy Young in 1974. His air is sparkling and his demeanor steady in contrast to the circus around him. And in the bullpen there was Rolly Fingers, the mustachioed pioneer of the modern closer who redefined late-inning dominance and delivered saves with icy calm, even winning a World Series MVP for his brilliance. And beyond the stars were unsung heroes like Gene Tennis, whose bat came alive in the biggest games, homering twice in his first 2 World Series at-bats in 1972 and setting the tone for the dynasty. And that's what made the A's so special. They weren't just top-heavy, they were deep, able to win tight games, slugfests, and pitchers' duels alike. And their defining moment came in the 1973 World Series against the heavily favored New York Mets, when Reggie Jackson crushed a towering 2-run homer in Game 7. A swing that didn't just secure a championship, but cemented the A's as baseball's new royalty. Because 3 straight World Series titles is a feat only the most elite teams have ever accomplished. And yet, what's just as memorable about this dynasty is how quickly it dissolved. Because Charlie Finley's clashes with his stars, combined with the looming era of free agency, meant that by the late 1970s the roster was stripped apart, leaving fans with a dynasty that burned hot but not long. And in that way, the swinging A's symbolized the era they lived in, colorful uniforms, booming personalities, and unforgettable October triumphs. A dynasty that proved chaos and brilliance can coexist, at least for a little while. If the Yankees of the 1930s defined inevitability and the Yankees of the 1950s defined longevity, then the Yankees of the late 1990s defined modern dominance, because in an era when free agency, television money, and parity were supposed to make dynasties impossible, the Bronx Bombers built one anyway, and not just any dynasty, but a machine that produced for World Series titles in 5 years, 6 pennants in 8, and a legacy that has kept them atop baseball's financial and cultural mountain ever since. And what makes this dynasty so fascinating is the balance it struck: part homegrown brilliance, part big market muscle, part old school grit, and part new era strategy. And it all revolved around for players who became both the foundation and the face of the franchise: Derek Jeter, Mariano Rivera, Jorge Posada, and Andy Pettitte. The core four, a group who rose together through the Yankees system and delivered together on the sport's biggest stage. And at the heart of it all was Jeter, the shortstop who seemed born for October, whose Rookie of the Year season in 1996 included the famous Jeffrey Mayer incident, and who would go on to collect 5 rings, a World Series MVP, and a reputation for clutch moments that made him a New York legend. And then there was Rivera, the silent assassin of the bullpen, whose cutter carved up hitters for nearly 2 decades, but in this dynasty stretch was nearly untouchable, locking down 183 regular season saves during the run and delivering a postseason era, barely above 0.70. Performances so dominant that opposing teams seemed beaten as soon as Enter Sandman began to play. And Posada, the fiery catcher who gave the Yankees offense from behind the plate and stability for a pitching staff that relied as much on chemistry as raw talent, and Pettitte, the durable lefty who seemed to save his best for October, collecting 19 postseason wins, still a record today, anchoring a rotation that was never flashy but always steady, with veterans like David Cone, David Wells, and Roger Clemens cycling through. And what tied it all together was the stewardship of Joe Torre, a manager who transformed from a journeyman skipper into a Hall of Fame leader the moment he took over in 1996. His calm demeanor and steady hand guiding a clubhouse of egos into a family that thrived under the spotlight. And the apex of this dynasty came in 1998, when the Yankees went 114-48 in the regular season and 11-2 in the postseason, finishing 125-50 overall, a record that stands as perhaps the greatest single season in modern baseball history, capped with a World Series sweep of the Padres. And that season crystallized what made this dynasty special: not just stars, but depth; not just power, but precision. A complete team in the truest sense. And what makes this dynasty unforgettable is not only the championships, but the way it made the Yankees feel inevitable again. The way other fan bases groaned at their success but couldn't deny their brilliance. And even when they began to falter in the early 2000s, losing the 2001 World Series in heartbreaking fashion after Rivers' rare blown save, and falling to the Marlins in 2003, the dynasty had already redefined what modern success looked like, blending homegrown development with financial might, and proving that even in the era of free agency, a dynasty wasn't just possible. It could still belong to the Yankees, and for an entire generation. These Yankees weren't just winners, they were the standard, the team that every October seemed destined to be there, and usually was. If the Yankees of the late 1990s embodied inevitability, then the San Francisco Giants of the early 2010s embodied improbability, because this was a dynasty that shouldn't have happened, a dynasty that analytics couldn't quite predict, a dynasty that seemed to defy logic at every turn, and yet somehow, in the span of 5 seasons, the Giants captured 3 World Series titles, building one of the most unlikely yet unforgettable runs in modern baseball history. And what makes this dynasty so distinct is that it was never about sustained regular season dominance. It was about October magic, because the Giants never won more than 94 games in a season. during their run, and they never repeated as division champions. But when the calendar flipped to October, something about them transformed. They became ruthless, resilient, almost untouchable, piling up a 33-14 postseason record during their championship years. An October juggernaut hiding inside a modest regular season team. And at the heart of it all was Buster Posey, the calm, unshakable catcher who embodied the soul of the dynasty. Rookie of the Year in 2010, MVP in 2012, a steady presence behind the plate and a bat that delivered again and again when it mattered most. The kind of player who doesn't just play on a dynasty, but defines it. And then there was Madison Bumgarner, the tall lefty whose postseason heroics reached almost mythical levels, culminating in 2014 when he pitched 21 innings in the World Series with a 0.43 ERA, including a legendary 5-inning save on 2 days rest in Game 7 against the Royals. A performance so superhuman it instantly entered baseball's pantheon of greatest feats, and surrounding them were players who might not have been generational talents, but became legends in their own right during these runs. Tim Lincecum, the Freak, whose back-to-back Cy Youngs made him one of the most electrifying pitchers of his era and whose postseason contributions remain vital. Pablo Sandoval, the Kung Fu Panda, who blasted 3 home runs in Game 1 of the 2012 World Series to set the tone for a sweep of the Tigers, a moment that captured his flair for the spectacular. And other contributors like Hunter Pence, whose speeches and unorthodox swing seemed to will the team forward, or Sergio Romo and Brian Wilson, quirky closers who slammed doors shut when the stakes were highest. And what ties all of this together is that the Giants, unlike most dynasties, never looked like a dynasty in the making. They weren't juggernauts. They weren't perennial 100-game winners. But when it came time to deliver, they did, again and again. And in doing so, they redefined what a modern dynasty could look like. Not a steamroller, but a team that knew how to win when winning mattered most. And for San Francisco fans, those 5 years became a golden era, not because the Giants looked unbeatable all season, but because they always found a way in the end. And when the dust settled, 3 rings in 5 years told the story that their opponents could never quite stop. That dynasties aren't always obvious in the standings, but in the trophies they leave behind. When you step back and look across more than a century of baseball dynasties, from the Boston Red Sox of 1912 to the improbable San Francisco Giants of 2014, what you see isn't just a record of championships, it's a living timeline of how the sport itself has evolved, because dynasties are never just about winning, they're about context, about how the game was played, what the world looked like outside the ballpark, and what it meant to fans in that moment. And that is what makes them so enduring. They aren't just victories, they are cultural landmarks. The Red Sox of the 1910s were the sport's first great power, and their collapse into an 86-year drought showed how fragile greatness could be. The Philadelphia A's proved you could build a super team before the word even existed, only to see it destroyed by the economics of its era. The Yankees built not 1, but 3 dynasties across different generations, each one reshaping what baseball dominance looked like. From DiMaggio and Gehrig's grace, to Mantle and Berra's longevity, to Jeter and Rivers' modern inevitability. The Cardinals of the 1940s showed grit could carry you through even the chaos of war. The Reds of the 1970s proved that sometimes the best team in history is measured at pure firepower. The Oakland A's of the 1970s demonstrated that chaos and brilliance can coexist, that a team can brawl with itself off the field but dominate together on it. And the Giants of the 2010s reminded us that not all dynasties are obvious. Sometimes they are built not on overwhelming regular seasons, but on the ability to rise again and again when the lights are brightest. The larger truth is this: every dynasty eventually ends. Even the most unstoppable machine eventually runs out of gas. The deepest roster eventually fractures. The brightest stars fade. That is the paradox of dynasties. They feel eternal when you are living through them, but in hindsight they are always fleeting. Fragile moments when greatness aligns perfectly before unraveling. But that fragility is also what makes them matter, what makes fans cherish them decades later. Dynasties don't just define teams. They define eras, and when they fall, they remind us that baseball, like life, is cyclical. That glory is never permanent, and that is why the next dynasty always feels possible. So when you ask, which dynasty was the greatest? Was it the sheer inevitability of the Yankees, the thunderous dominance of the big red machine, the improbable magic of the Giants? The truth is, there is no single answer. The greatest dynasty is the one that defined greatness for you, the one you lived through, the one that made October feel larger than life. Because in the end, every dynasty is really the same story told in different ways. A team comes together, rises above everyone else, leaves behind a legacy of rings and memories, and then passes the torch to the next, and that cycle, that promise of the next dynasty just waiting to emerge, is part of why baseball never stops pulling us back.